Approved by the Senate on August 29, 1957, this was the first federal civil rights law since the Reconstruction era. Its primary objective was to enforce voter disenfranchisement stemming from race, color, creed, etc. The act officially went into effect 2 weeks later on September 9th, and I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the key events that led up to this point. I'm going to go over most of these events in just a small detail. Some of these I may make full videos on for themselves later because I'm really interested in them. And I have a bunch of different events that I left out, so I might make a part 2. I would appreciate if you would comment with your favorite either fact. I would appreciate if you wouldn't mind commenting what your favorite event was, or if there's an event that you think I left out that should have been mentioned in this video. The first enslaved Africans arrive in 1619. On August 20th of 1619, some Spaniards are performing their usual duties of importing slaves to Mexico when they were attacked and robbed by some American colonizers demanding their product. The stolen slaves went on to become the first documented slaves to arrive under the British rule with the intention to build their country. The Indian Massacre of 1622. This one requires a bit of context. The colonizers landed in 1607 and almost immediately started disrespecting the natives, trying to push Christianity, stealing food, and ignoring the boundaries that the chief Powhatan explicitly expressed. This led to one of their leaders named John Smith to be captured, and unfortunately the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, whom was his weak spot, convinced him to let the Englishmen go. The Englishmen had clocked that the daughter had pull, and this information led them to target her as a subject for capture and leverage later in 1613. Going back to 1607, their unjustified arrogance combined with their poor planning and lack of knowledge on how to properly colonize kicked off the era known as the Starving Times from 1607 to 1610, during which the ignorant whites resorted to cannibalizing their own, prioritizing pregnant women so they can get more food out of the kill. In 1613, Pocahontas was kidnapped by the colonizers and they sent demands of food and weapons in exchange. The chief eventually conceded to their demands so he can get his daughter back, but they refused to return her. She eventually married one of the captors named John Ralph, converted to Christianity, and even went on a trip with him back to the Britons to become one of the first trophy wives of the founding colonizers. And unfortunately, she ended up passing on the way back from the trip in 1617. It's speculated that she was either poisoned or died from a lack of sanitation practices, as the whites were notoriously dirty at that time. I'm sure that this is the reason that the chief passed not long after that in 1618 as well. The Englishmen thought that Pocahontas' marriage meant that peace was possible with the natives, so they started relaxing, mingling more, and lowering their guard. It's rumored that in 1621, a native war chief was killed by the whites, and the story goes that he had killed one of the colonizers before that, stolen his clothes, so they were just returning the favor. The new chief told the colonizers that he would let this go because he deserved it. He then went home, got his brother, organized a council, obtained these things called war names. They did a celebration of life for their old chief, and then they started planning their revenge. Fast forward to March 22nd of 1622, they walked up to the colonizer camps and asked them to hang out. While the colonist guards were down, they stole everything in their homes that could be used as a weapon and murdered everyone they could find. They then burned their settlements to the ground and celebrated their victory. They should and could have finished the job, but in their culture, when you suffer a great defeat such as this, you're supposed to leave and yield with your dignity intact. But these are desperate, money-hungry colonizers we're talking about. Their response was to have the Virginia company send more bodies to perpetuate the war, with their goal now switched from peace and love to total domination. The Virginia Hereditary Slavery Law of 1662. Until 1662, children born from a slave parent still had the chance to escape the curse that their parents had suffered through, especially if their father was free himself, or more importantly, white. The House of Burgess, with approval from Governor Sir William Berkeley, passed a law declaring that a child's status would follow that of the mother. Shaped by the Virginia Company's money-hungry foundation, they eventually realized that they were losing money by letting those kids slip through and escape slavery without paying their dues. The first slave patrols in 1704. From the 1630s, the colonizers in areas like Boston and New York had organized an informal chore called the Night Watch that was filled with men that had no training, little if any education, and they were poorly paid, but they loved killing, so they just did it for the game. South Carolina kicked off the first official, formally recognized slave patrols, which were state-sanctioned and tax-funded, armed with men whose primary purpose was to capture runaway slaves, squash any potential resistance or uprisings, and terrorizing black folks into compliance. The night watch was basically just like to keep the neighborhood safe, so they were stopping fires, helping people with stuff, anything that might seem like a crime. But the first slave patrols were basically the first actual organized state-funded police force, and their primary motive was just to stop slavery from ending. The Stono Rebellion of 1739. This was the largest slave uprising in the Americas, and it was led by a man named Jimmy on September 9, 1739. Jimmy had gathered about 20 other enslaved Africans, and they robbed a weapons cache / storefront, killed the people inside, and began to march towards their promised freedom. As they marched south, they beat drums, carried a banner, and chanted while rallying others to join them. Their numbers had swelled from their original 20 to anywhere between 60 and 100 rebels. They killed at least 24 whites and burned every plantation that they crossed paths with on their way to Florida. The rebellion was put down by the militia later that day, with many of the rebels getting killed in battle while the rest were just executed after they were captured. This led to the Negro Act of 1740, which stripped away nearly every remaining right that every African still had. They could no longer assemble in groups, grow their own food, earn money, or learn how to read and write. Any even attempt at literacy or movement without permission was met with brutal punishment. It even limited the rights of slave owners, so they weren't allowed to free their own slaves anymore without state or government approval. The act was designed to lock black people into a permanent state of surveillance and control, and it became a model for other colonies to copy. Congress passed a law that banned the importation of enslaved Africans at the beginning of 1808. On paper, this looked like a step forward, but really it was a hollow victory. The ban didn't end slavery, it just shifted the business model. So instead of buying Africans from abroad, enslavers turned to America's black women and turned their bodies into factories, forcing procreation in order to grow the slave population domestically. The domestic slave trade exploded, with enslaved people bought and sold like livestock across state lines. Smuggling from Africa also continued in secret, so while 1808 had closed one door, it basically just reinforced another. Slavery became now fully entrenched as a homegrown, self-reproducing system, with black families being torn apart not by ships across the Atlantic, but by the auction blocks and forced migration in the U.S. Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner was an intelligent, self-taught preacher that was deeply spiritual and loved, trusted, and respected in his community. He had always had dreams and visions that he believed were from God, and this belief led to one of the most significant rebellions in history. There was an eclipse that took place in February of 1831 that he took as a sign to prepare for retaliation. So from then until the next sign arrived in the form of a solar anomaly in which the sun appeared bluish green in August that same year, he prepared his mind, body, and soul, as well as began to rouse his brothers enslaved. Soon after that solar phenomenon, he and his boys gathered in the woods, prayed, probably smoked a blunt, and went on a killing spree of as many colonizers as they could find before they were hunted down. He managed to escape in the middle of a gunfight and survived off the grid for about 6 weeks until he was spotted foraging by some snitch-ass slaves that told their owners where they had seen him. Not long after that, he was captured easily, and he told a lawyer by the name of Thomas Gray his story before they mutilated his body.